Melissa survived a failed saline infusion abortion in 1977. She founded the Abortion Survivors Network in 2012, which seeks to educate the public about failed abortions and survivors while providing emotional, mental, and spiritual support to abortion survivors. She has a master's degree in social work and has worked in the fields of substance abuse, mental health, domestic violence and sexual assault counseling, and child welfare. Melissa has been featured on television and radio programs, including The 700 Club, EWTN, Fox News, Focus on the Family, American Family Radio, The Mike Huckabee Show, and last but not least, the Ed Martin Movement. Melissa is the author of You Carried Me, a Daughter's Memoir, which was released in January of 2017. She and her husband Ryan live in Missouri, and they have 2 children. Please welcome Melissa.
Well, who put me up after break? No, I am just grateful to be here. I know some of you hear my name, or maybe you have passed me in the hallway and you think, that woman looks familiar. I've been doing this for about 12 years now. As you heard in my introduction, I have led a fairly normal life, except for the way that I came into this world. And God called me to not live a comfortable life. And so if some of you think I look familiar, it's probably because in the 2012 election, I did an ad with the Susan B. Anthony list entitled, How Will You Answer? Essentially asking back then the questions that we now hear time and time again in our society, right? How will you answer the question about the sanctity of life? How will you answer the question about what should happen to children like me after they survive abortions? I truly believe that the issue of life is monumental to the 2020 elections. And I am so thankful for President Trump and his administration and all that they have done for life. Absolutely. I was blessed to be in the Oval Office this past February along with some friends of mine, and I had the great opportunity to thank the president on behalf of survivors like me that I work with. And so I am just grateful to be here with you all and to share a little bit of my knowledge with you. A lot of people know me because of my story, and I'm going to share a little bit about that with you today. But I also want to inform you and equip you, because we live in a society that wants to say day in and day out that people like me don't exist, right? We hear this every single day. Children don't survive abortions. NARAL, Planned Parenthood, the abortion lobby actually sat and tweeted that in a hearing that I was testifying for before Congress earlier this year. Here I am sharing my story, and they're tweeting out saying that I don't exist. Well, I'm going to give you the information so you can let people know that we do exist. Our lives are important, and this is relevant to today's world. I heard that we had some font issues, so we're all going to see together how this rolls out today. So you heard a little bit in my introduction about the network. So we are a 501c3. We're based out of Missouri. I'm from Kansas City. Don't hold it against me. City of St. Louis. Thank you. We offer support to survivors. What I'm going to talk a lot about today is that survivors have been happening throughout history. So I'm going to give you some education on that. What hasn't happened before, though, is we haven't had a central location where people could come for support. We haven't had a place where stories have been put together. A lot of times people will contact me and say, Melissa, I found this story or I found that story, and I'll say, hey, that's great, but I've never heard of them before. So if you know an abortion survivor, send them our way, because they can dismiss my voice, but they can't dismiss hundreds upon thousands of voices when we come together. So you will see us more in 2020. We're working on some really interesting projects, and trust me, when you find out what we're doing, you will not only be excited, but you know the rest of the world is finally going to take notice. I actually have chills when I say that right now. You will see it on the news very, very soon, some of the projects that we're working on. So when it comes to those survivors that we have in the network, a lot of times people will say, Melissa, how come there's lots of survivors but we don't hear their story? One of the major reasons is that because if we're going to use a survivor's story for advocacy purposes, meaning they're going to go testify before Congress, we're going to put them in a really visible project, we have some standards. And that is that there need to be medical records or there need to be notarized statements by doctors or other individuals who can support that story. The reality is the abortion industry themselves have prevented many survivors from ever having any record of what happened to them. That's part of what I try to do in our world is let people know we don't have medical records because they don't want us to. Because they don't want us to exist, they don't want to document the circumstances of our lives. So unfortunately, right now we live in a world that is not friendly to abortion survivors. You know, it's my sincerest hope that someday we can have every story of every abortion survivor shared in our world and have them be supported and respected. But until then, we have a lot of documentation. Now, behind the scenes, we will always support any survivor, no matter what level of documentation they have. And I'm going to share with you in a minute some of those that we work with. This is such an interesting statement if you haven't seen it before. It started to make the rounds this year as we started to talk about abortion in afterbirth infanticide. But I had known this quote for a very long time, and if you can't read it, I'll read it for you. It's from Dr. Willard Cates from the CDC surveillance group. It said, live births are little known because organized medicine, from fear of public clamor and legal action, treats them more as an embarrassment to be hushed up than a problem to be solved. It's like turning yourself into the IRS for an audit. The tendency is not to report because there are only negative incentives. Right out of the mouth of the CDC. So as people are saying this doesn't happen and we don't have any data, there's where it all started, right? Even back then in 1981, there was a series in the Philadelphia Inquirer that really started to chronicle failed abortions and children who lived. And so that's how we got the sweet term, the dreaded complication. That's actually how abortion survivors are described in our society, the dreaded complication of an abortion. But it came out of their mouths long ago. So there was the 1980 case of Dr. Melnick, and so he was actually convicted of infanticide, but there was a very lenient consequence given to him back then. Other cases some of you may remember from the 1990s were Ana Rosa Rodriguez. If you've seen the picture of her, she's missing an arm. It was a horrific, brutal abortion, and she survived it. I just heard the other day that she is in college right now, studying to be a pharmacist, and I am so grateful for her that she is going on and living her life. But there are these stories that have existed throughout time. I think we need to talk about Born Alive legislation for a minute before I go through some of the history. You know, as we know at the federal level, the Democrats have continued to block the Born Alive legislation well over 80 times. The press conference that Rebecca was talking about was a press conference with the House that I was at earlier this year when we did a press conference simply asking for legislators to sign on to the discharge petition to force it to a vote. Do you know how many signatures we're still missing today? 14. 14. They held a hearing about it in DC earlier this week, and I couldn't be there because of a prior engagement. There were 3 Democrats there. This should not be a partisan issue, but they have made it a partisan issue. And so we have to educate people about what is happening. And, you know, one of the points that I made up here I think is a really, really important one for you to share with other people. When we live in a culture right now that is expanding abortion aggressively through all 9 months of pregnancy, the greater the likelihood is that somebody like me is going to survive an abortion. The more this is expanded, the greater the likelihood is going to be that somebody like me is accidentally born alive. So, if anything, we need to have Born Alive legislation even more so now than we ever have. But if you're paying attention, not only are they blocking at the federal level, but we have states like Illinois and New York that are stripping away basic protections for survivors. But yet people want to say that there's no need for this legislation, right? Which brings me to the final point of that slide. 19 states do not have laws requiring care to be provided to children who survive abortions. Unbelievable. So we know there's not a hard number when it comes to survivors. I can tell you through our network, we've had contact with over 300 survivors. About a 2-to-1 ratio of women over men, but I think a lot of that is cultural in nature in terms of women being more likely to contact us than men, because men have been told none of this is their business in the first place, right? So we've had about 300 abortion survivors, but statistically we know that there are hundreds, if not thousands, when you start to go through the data from the CDC about the failure rates of late-term abortions. Some of you have probably seen the CDC data. It started to come out more and more recently. They have indicated that definitively there were 143 children who survived abortions in an 11-year period. But the American Center for Law and Justice thinks the number is much higher as they look through data, and they've indicated 362. I would say it's much, much higher than that, based on what I've experienced. Also, I think this is very important for you to know too. Only a handful of states require reporting on abortion survivors. You see Michigan, Oklahoma, Texas, Florida, Arizona, and Minnesota. And even then, there are still issues in reporting. I was working with some legislators in Texas earlier this year when they were taking up this cause, and the Department of Health and Human Services for Texas came in and said, well, there haven't been any. And we're saying, show us how you're tracking that data, right? And the issue was how they were not tracking it and not asking the right questions. So even if states are supposed to be collecting the data, it doesn't mean that it's getting to where it needs to. So what numbers do we have? Minnesota had 3 survivors, 2017 and 2018, 5 survivors in 2016. That 2018 report, if you haven't read it, absolutely infuriated me. Because not only did they detail the outcome for those 3 survivors, but in one spot, it actually said there was no information given on whether that child was provided medical care. And I read the report and I said, has anybody asked what happened to that child? And people said, no, we don't ask those questions. And I said, then I will, and I'm not going to stop. So you need to go and you look through those reports and you need to start asking the questions that need to be answered. What is happening to children like me? As you can see, Arizona had 10 in 2017. Florida's numbers are high also, but yet we're told time and time again, right, by the Democrats and the media that this doesn't happen. And the question that I keep begging in our world is, how many survivors is it really going to take? How many survivors is it finally going to take for them to say that we deserve to be protected? I think I know the answer to that, don't you? Sadly, to them, I don't think it matters. But it should matter to us, and that's why we're going to make it matter to other people. So, as I shared, we've seen survivors throughout history. Here's a little bit of that history. If you've ever had a chance to see it before, some of it will look familiar. There was a baby long ago who survived at approximately 23 weeks gestation. This baby had Down syndrome. How many times are we told that a child is aborted because they have issues that are incompatible with life? That baby was born at 23 weeks with Down syndrome and survived for 34 minutes? Man, how many times is this happening? There was the conviction in the 1990s for Dr. Kenneth Edlin. He was charged with killing a survivor. Gosnell was not the first one. But as you can see, it was overturned later. The oldest survivor that I actually know of was a survivor in 1936. We have many, many survivors that we support socially in our network who survived at-home attempts to abort. We also have people who survived illegal abortions in other countries. So the youngest survivors that we know of are little babies still today. We have children in our network who survived chemical abortions, and I'm not talking just reversals, right? We know you can reverse chemical abortions. These children survived both pills of the chemical abortion and are alive today. Then we have survivors into their 70s. And of course, we know here in St. Louis, Planned Parenthood's been making the news a lot lately, right? And they actually were cited in the AP for having a number of failed abortions. It's happening all over. So when we talk about the survivors throughout history, we know that lots of them survived chemical abortions. When I'm starting to gather information from doctors, they're telling us it was probably early chemical abortions, right? They've perfected it now, but back then that's probably what it was. We also know that they were given progesterone to women long ago to try to stop some of those abortions. That's actually abortion pill reversal protocol today. So it's really interesting to see things from the past that are actually relevant to what's happening today. We know of survivors who survived twin abortions, where they know there's one twin, but they don't know that there's a second one. I'm going to talk about that more in a second. We also have survivors where they stop the abortion procedure because the baby is too big. They start the abortion and go, whoa, this pregnancy is much further along than what I was expecting. I can't do this without causing harm to the woman, or it's going to cost more money, right? That's the other part of it. Unfortunately, late-term abortions are big, big money. We also see a number of survivors who they are alive because they straight up induce that labor, just like with that child with Down syndrome, right? They're inducing labor with the intent of a child not surviving an early delivery or leaving the child to die. These things have been happening for decades. So we also know that there are generations of survivors. On the photo you see on the screen on the left, that's my friend Melody and also my friend Claire. Claire is a twin survivor, and Melody survived an illegal abortion in Mexico. The reason why I share Melody's story is because she had multiple abortions herself before she found out late in life that she had survived an abortion. There are generations of survivors that exist in our world. So if we know somebody from 1936, think about all of those generations to come from that life, right? There are generations of survivors. Some of my friends you see on the screen, again, there's Claire Colwell. Many of you know Gianna Jessen. We were together in Washington, D.C. We were on Fox a number of times. That's Josiah Presley on the left. You'll see he's missing part of his arm because he survived a curettage abortion in Korea. So they were slicing, only got a little sliver. So other survivors that you might see publicly, in addition to those, Nick Hoot, many of you have probably seen that name in the news recently. He doesn't speak a lot publicly, but he survived a dismemberment abortion at 24 weeks. From what we can gather, I've been working with a former abortionist who's now pro-life to kind of piece together, right, how do these things happen? Because it's an absolute miracle. But what we can gather is he is missing a number of limbs, but what she believes is that the body somehow was able to stop itself from bleeding out, and the amniotic sac then reformed again because he was able to stay in the womb until almost a full gestation. It is an absolute miracle. Hope Hoffman is another one you'll see. We're working with her on some videos. She actually has a scar on her forehead and was missing part of her scalp as a result of surviving that abortion. So those are some of the stories you'll see. As I put on here, really the most powerful stories for me are the stories that you will probably never come across because survivors keep their story very, very private for many, many reasons. My story is not private. That is me. I'm going to end my time with you by sharing a little bit of my story. The reality is that it is a very long story, but the short version is, yes, I'm 42 years old. Some of you did the math when they said, right? It's okay. I'm 42. I'm such a mom, right? I'm just such an ordinary person like everyone else. But 42 years ago, my biological mother, as a 19-year-old college student, had a saline infusion abortion forced upon her by her own family. My maternal grandmother was a prominent nurse in Sioux City, Iowa. She forced the abortion upon my birth mother with the help of her friend and colleague, the local abortionist. They believed that no one would ever find out that it wasn't her choice, and most certainly no one would ever hear from me. That saline infusion abortion, many of you remember it from back in the 1970s, or maybe you've heard about it. That saline infusion abortion involved injecting a toxic salt solution into the amniotic fluid surrounding the preborn baby in the womb. The intent of that toxic salt solution was to poison and scald the child to death. Usually the procedure lasted about 72 hours. The child would soak in that toxic salt solution, and then their life was ended. And then they would induce premature labor with the intent of expelling that deceased child from the womb. It's an excruciating process. And for women also. I have met many women who have told me they could feel their child thrashing about in the womb, fighting for their life before they ultimately lost it. We actually know through my medical records that I didn't soak in that toxic salt solution for 3 days. I actually soaked in it for 5 because they could not successfully induce my birth mother's labor. And so on the 5th day of the abortion procedure, they were finally successful, and I was delivered at St. Luke's Hospital in Sioux City, Iowa, believing that I would be a successful abortion. But lo and behold, I was accidentally born alive. I wish I could tell, yeah, right? I am grateful. Too bad our world can't rejoice in that fact, right? It's an incredibly sad reality that many people look upon my birth as an accident and something that should have been prevented. And I also know that there were people at the hospital that day who again tried to thwart the plans for my life. My parents were told years ago that the abortionist demanded that I be left in that hospital room to die. We actually know now that it was my grandmother who told the other nurses to do so. And I don't falter for that. I know that's hard for people to hear, but if you know me well, you'll know that I love her and I've forgiven her no matter what decisions she's made about my life. But she demanded that the nurses there at the hospital with her leave me to die. We were told early on a couple of nurses fought to save my life, and I was contacted by a nurse directly just about 2 years ago who was able to pinpoint that story even further for us. She was working in the neonatal intensive care unit that day 42 years ago when a tall blonde nurse rushed me in. I was laid aside. If you look through my medical records, my APGAR score was terrible. I was nearly dead after 5 minutes. So we will probably never know how long I was left, where I was left. But what we do know is that I was laid aside for a period of time, and that tall blonde nurse stood up to my grandmother, whisked me off to the NICU, and ultimately I was provided medical care that sustained my life. My life never should have been left in the hands of my abortionist. My life never should have been left in the fate of whoever was working that day doing the right thing. I am forever grateful that that nurse risked her job to save me. But every child deserves better than what I was subjected to. And the story of my life, as I shared, is actually much further and deeper than that. What I can tell you really briefly is that I am now united with my biological mother. She lives here in Missouri. We didn't know when we moved to Kansas City about 7 years ago. She lives in the Kansas City metro area, along with one of my half-sisters. It is a story that has been redeemed and restored, and it is a beautiful story. But I always have to remind people it never would have been redeemed and restored if I wouldn't have first lived. Think about how many stories have not been able to be lived out because children have been aborted or they weren't provided timely medical care. This is of the utmost importance to all of us, I know, but we have to make sure that our culture understands why it should be important to all of them. So in, Dr. Piper's words, to steal them from him, truth matters, doesn't it? The truth matters about life. Life matters. And every single one of our efforts when it comes to lives being protected and respected matters. And so let's go forth together and change our culture for good. Thank you so much for being here.